I was kicked out of my home for failing a test, now I'm earning thousands, and my parents are begging me for money. Hey Reddit, I'm Emma, 26, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around how much my life has changed. 8 years ago, my parents kicked me out of the house because I failed an important test. It was the lowest point of my life, and I thought I'd never recover. But now, I'm running a successful company, making more money than I ever dreamed possible, and the same parents who threw me out are begging me for help. It's surreal, and I've got so many mixed feelings about it. This is the story of how I went from rock bottom to building a life I'm proud of, from being rejected by my own family to becoming the person I always knew I could be. Growing up, I always felt like I was living in the shadow of my older sister, Caroline. She was the epitome of success, valedictorian, straight-A student, and a star athlete who never seemed to stumble. My parents, Mark and Linda, adored her, and their expectations for me were just as high if not higher. They saw Caroline's accomplishments as the standard, and I was expected to follow in her footsteps without missing a beat. My dad was a financial analyst, a no-nonsense guy who believed in hard work, discipline, and the power of success. He ran our household like a business, with detailed schedules, constant evaluations, and clear expectations. He always said that failure wasn't an option, and he drilled that mantra into me from a young age. My mom was no different. A former valedictorian herself, she had given up her career to focus on raising us, and she saw our achievements as her own. She was the kind of parent who kept a calendar of every school event, every test date, and every extracurricular activity, making sure I was always prepared and never idle. When I was 6, I remember coming home with a report card full of A's and 1 B. I was so proud of myself, but when I showed it to my parents, their faces fell. My dad barely glanced at the other grades before zeroing in on the B. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. I didn't know what to say. I tried my best, but it wasn't enough. From that moment on, I understood that anything less than perfection was unacceptable. I spent my childhood chasing after their approval, burying myself in books, extracurriculars, and endless hours of studying. While other kids were outside playing, I was inside memorizing flashcards. Every test felt like a make-or-break moment, and the pressure to succeed weighed on me constantly. By the time I reached high school, my parents' expectations had reached an all-time high. They saw my education as an investment in their legacy, and they weren't willing to tolerate anything that didn't fit their vision of success. They enrolled me in advanced classes, hired private tutors, and pushed me to join every club that might look good on a college application. My schedule was packed from morning until night, and there was no room for anything that didn't contribute to my academic goals. Caroline had already set the bar impossibly high by getting into an Ivy League school on a full scholarship, and my parents were determined that I would do the same. My mom would constantly remind me of Caroline's achievements, comparing my progress to hers in a way that felt both suffocating and demoralizing. Caroline never had trouble with this, she'd say whenever I struggled with a math problem or missed a practice session. "You need to try harder." I hated the comparisons, but I was desperate for their approval. I pushed myself to the brink, studying late into the night, sacrificing my social life, and pouring everything I had into my schoolwork. I wanted to be seen as more than just Caroline's little sister, I wanted to be enough on my own. But no matter how hard I tried, it always felt like I was falling short. My junior year was the most intense yet. My parents were hyper-focused on my upcoming college applications, and every grade felt like it carried the weight of my entire future. They hired a private math tutor for me, convinced that I needed extra help to ace the AP Calculus exam. Math had always been my weakest subject, and I was terrified of letting them down. The tutor was strict, and every session felt like a battle. But I kept pushing, determined not to disappoint them. I remember one night, sitting at the kitchen table with my dad as he quizzed me on calculus formulas. I'd been up since 5 a.m., attending school, practice, and then tutoring, and my brain was fried. I made a mistake on a problem, and my dad slammed his hand on the table in frustration. "Emma, you can't afford to make these kinds of mistakes. You're not going to get anywhere if you keep this up." I fought back tears, nodding and apologizing, but inside, I was crumbling. The pressure was relentless, and I felt like I was drowning. I'd lost all sense of who I was outside of my grades, my achievements, and the constant need to prove myself. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. My parents' approval was the only thing that mattered, and I was terrified of losing it. The AP exams were the culmination of everything my parents had been pushing me toward. They were obsessed with the idea of me scoring high enough to earn college credits and strengthen my application to top-tier universities. I studied for months, sacrificing sleep, weekends, and any semblance of a normal teenage life. I'd wake up before dawn to review flashcards, attend school all day, and then spend hours with my tutor, drilling calculus problems until my eyes blurred. On the day of the calculus exam, I was a nervous wreck. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours the night before, my stomach was in knots, and my hands were shaking as I sat down at my desk. I tried to calm myself, but the pressure was overwhelming. I kept thinking about all the times my parents had told me how important this test was, how it would determine my future, and how I couldn't afford to mess up. As I started the exam, my mind went blank. I couldn't focus. Every formula I'd memorized seemed to slip away, and the harder I tried to concentrate, the more panicked I became. I looked around the room, seeing my classmates scribbling away confidently, and felt a wave of nausea. I knew I was failing, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. When the results came in weeks later, my worst fears were confirmed. I'd scored a 1, the lowest possible score. I'd failed, and I felt like my world had collapsed. I remember staring at the screen, numb with shock. All the late nights, the studying, the sacrifices, it had all been for nothing. I knew that telling my parents would be the hardest thing I'd ever done. I waited until after dinner to break the news, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad was sitting at the table, going over some paperwork, and my mom was cleaning up in the kitchen. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I got my AP scores back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My dad looked up, his expression expectant. "And?" I hesitated, tears welling up in my eyes. I failed the calculus exam." The room went silent. My mom stopped what she was doing and turned to look at me, her face a mix of disbelief and anger. My dad's expression hardened, and I could feel the disappointment radiating off of him. "You failed," he repeated, his voice cold and sharp. I nodded, unable to find the words to explain. I wanted to tell them how hard I'd tried, how much I'd studied, and how devastated I was. But I knew it wouldn't matter. To them, failure was unacceptable, and there was no excuse that would change that. "We gave you every opportunity," my dad said, his voice rising. "We hired tutors, we made sacrifices, and this is how you repay us? Do you have any idea how much you've let us down?" "I'm sorry," I stammered, my vision blurred by tears. "I tried my best." My mom shook her head, her expression filled with contempt. "Your best isn't good enough, Emma. You've embarrassed us. We had such high hopes for you, and you've thrown it all away." I stood there, feeling like I was being crushed under the weight of their disappointment. I wanted to disappear, to run away and never look back. My parents had always been my harshest critics, but this was different. This wasn't just about a bad grade, this was about their belief that I was a failure, unworthy of their love and support. That night, my parents called me into the living room. My dad was sitting in his armchair, his arms crossed, and my mom stood beside him, looking stern and unyielding. I could tell from their expressions that this wasn't going to be a conversation, it was going to be a sentencing. "We've been talking," my dad began, his tone cold. "And we've decided that it's time for you to take responsibility for your actions. You're 18 now, Emma. An adult. And adults face the consequences of their failures." I stared at him, not understanding. "What are you saying?" "We're saying that you need to find somewhere else to stay," my mom said bluntly. "You have 1 week to figure it out. Maybe this will teach you to take your future seriously." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own parents were kicking me out because I'd failed a test. I begged them to reconsider, to give me another chance, but they were unmoved. To them, I was a disappointment, and they were done wasting their time and money on me. The next few days were a blur of panic and desperation. I packed what little I could carry, clothes, a few personal items, and my laptop, and left the only home I'd ever known. I called friends, trying to find somewhere to crash, but most of them were still living at home or didn't have space. I was scared, angry, and utterly alone. I spent my last night at home lying on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the boxes of my belongings, trying to make sense of what had happened. I felt like a failure in every sense of the word. My parents had always been my safety net, and now, without warning, they'd ripped it away. I had no plan, no money, and no idea what to do next. I ended up crashing on the floor of my friend Lily's tiny studio apartment. She was one of the few people who didn't judge me or ask too many questions. She just let me stay as long as I needed. But even with her kindness, I felt like a burden. Her place was cramped and cluttered, with barely enough room for one person, let alone two. I slept on a pile of blankets next to her bed, surrounded by my boxes, and spent my days applying for jobs and trying to figure out how to move forward. Finding work was harder than I'd expected. I had no degree, no real work experience, and no idea what I wanted to do. I applied to fast food restaurants, retail stores, and any other job that didn't require a college education. After weeks of rejections, I finally got hired as a waitress at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. It was far from glamorous, but it was a paycheck, and I was grateful for the chance to start over. Working the graveyard shift was brutal. I'd go in at 10 p.m. and work until 6 a.m., serving coffee and greasy food to truckers, night owls, and the occasional bar crowd. The hours were long, the pay was terrible, and I'd often leave with sore feet, aching muscles, and a pocket full of loose change and tips. My uniform was stained with coffee and grease, and every night felt like a marathon of exhaustion. But as tough as the job was, it was nothing compared to the emotional toll of being on my own. I felt like a failure, constantly haunted by the thought that I'd let my parents down. Every time I saw a family eating together at the diner, I was reminded of what I'd lost. I'd scroll through social media during my breaks, seeing my old classmates celebrating their college acceptances and new beginnings, and I'd feel a sharp pang of jealousy. They were moving forward, while I was stuck in a never-ending loop of late-night shifts and dead-end jobs. Lily did her best to keep my spirits up, but even she couldn't shield me from the reality of my situation. We'd stay up late talking, her sitting on the bed and me on the floor, as we shared our dreams and fears. She was the first person I told about how my parents had kicked me out, and she listened without judgment, offering me the compassion I so desperately needed. "Emma, you're going to get through this," she'd say, handing me a cup of instant ramen after a particularly rough shift. "You're stronger than you think." But no matter how much Lily encouraged me, the truth was, I felt lost. I didn't know who I was outside of my parents' expectations. I'd spent my whole life trying to be perfect, and now that I'd fallen short, I didn't know how to pick myself up. I was trapped in survival mode, working just to keep a roof over my head and food in my stomach, with no idea what my future looked like. One night, after a particularly bad shift, I sat in Lily's apartment, staring at my old textbooks and feeling completely defeated. I missed the structure of school, the sense of purpose that came with having goals and deadlines. I knew I couldn't keep working at the diner forever, but I had no idea how to break free from the cycle I was in. Then, one night, while scrolling aimlessly online, I stumbled across an ad for a free coding class at the local community college. I'd always been curious about tech, but it was never something I'd pursued seriously. My parents had been so focused on traditional academic success that I'd never considered alternative paths. But now, with nothing to lose, I thought, why not? It was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, it was the fresh start I needed. The first day of my computer science class felt like stepping into a foreign world. I was nervous, surrounded by students of all ages who seemed to know way more than I did. The professor, Dr. Patel, was a kind man in his late 40s with a knack for making complex concepts seem accessible. He welcomed us with a warm smile and immediately dove into the basics of coding, explaining things in a way that even a beginner like me could grasp. I was hooked from the start. Coding was like solving puzzles, and each line of code I wrote felt like unlocking a new level in a game. I loved the logic of it, the creativity it required, and the sense of accomplishment I felt when my code finally worked. It was the first time in years that I'd felt excited about learning, and it gave me a sense of control that I hadn't had in a long time. I started spending every spare moment in the computer lab, teaching myself new programming languages and building small projects just for fun. I'd sit there for hours, hunched over my laptop, forgetting about the world outside. I wasn't thinking about my parents, my past, or my failures. I was focused on the here and now, on making my code work and improving my skills. Dr. Patel noticed my dedication and started giving me extra assignments to challenge me. He'd stay after class to answer my questions, offer advice, and encourage me to keep pushing myself. He saw potential in me that I hadn't even realized was there, and his belief in my abilities gave me the confidence to keep going. One day, he pulled me aside after class. "Emma, you've got a real talent for this," he said, his voice full of encouragement. "Have you ever thought about pursuing a career in tech?" I was taken aback. No one had ever suggested that I had talent before, let alone in something as complex as coding. I explained my situation, how I'd been kicked out of my house, working night shifts just to get by, and trying to figure out my next steps. Dr. Patel listened attentively, nodding as I spoke. "You've been through a lot," he said thoughtfully. "But you're resilient. I can see that. You're not just learning, you're thriving. Keep going, Emma. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do." His words stuck with me, and from that moment on, I was determined to prove him right. I started looking for freelance gigs online, taking on small coding projects for local businesses. I built websites, fixed bugs, and designed apps, learning as I went. It wasn't easy, there were countless late nights, frustrations, and mistakes, but I loved the challenge. Every project was an opportunity to learn something new, and every paycheck was a step closer to independence. Slowly but surely, I started to build a reputation as a reliable coder. Clients would recommend me to their friends, and soon I had more work than I could handle. I saved every dollar I earned, putting it toward a laptop upgrade, better software, and eventually, my own place. I moved out of Lily's apartment and into a tiny studio of my own. It wasn't much, just a small room with a bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked a busy street, but it was mine, and it felt like a fresh start. With my newfound stability, I decided to take a leap of faith. I enrolled in a full-time coding bootcamp, a 3-month intensive program that promised to turn beginners into job-ready developers. It was a big risk, both financially and emotionally, but I knew it was what I needed to take my skills to the next level. The bootcamp was grueling. We'd spend 12-hour days coding, learning new languages, and working on group projects that pushed us to our limits. I was surrounded by people who were just as hungry for success as I was, and the environment was electric. We'd stay late into the night, fueled by caffeine and determination, pushing each other to keep going even when we were exhausted. But as tough as it was, I thrived. I aced every assignment, became a leader in my cohort, and gained the confidence to tackle projects I never would have attempted on my own. By the end of the program, I had a portfolio full of work I was proud of, and more importantly, the skills I needed to land a real job in tech. After completing the bootcamp, I landed an internship at a tech startup. It was unpaid, but I jumped at the chance to get my foot in the door. I worked alongside experienced developers, soaking up every bit of knowledge I could. I was the first one in the office every morning and the last one to leave, eager to prove myself. The startup was a fast-paced environment, full of tight deadlines, constant pivots, and high expectations. But I loved it. I thrived on the adrenaline of solving complex problems, collaborating with my team, and seeing my work come to life in real time. My boss, Megan, took notice of my work ethic and started giving me more responsibility. She'd let me sit in on client meetings, ask for my input on projects, and even put me in charge of leading smaller teams. Megan was everything I aspired to be: confident, knowledgeable, and fiercely independent. She'd built the company from the ground up after losing her job during the 2008 financial crisis, and she wasn't afraid to take risks. She became a mentor to me, encouraging me to think bigger and believe in my own potential. "You're a natural, Emma," she told me one day after I'd successfully pitched a new project to a client. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You've got what it takes to make it in this industry." With Megan's encouragement, I started to think about what I wanted for my future. I loved my job, but I'd always dreamed of being my own boss, of creating something that was truly mine. I began to explore the idea of starting my own business, a tech consulting firm that would help small businesses optimize their digital presence. It was a daunting prospect, but Megan was with me every step of the way. She helped me draft a business plan, introduced me to potential clients, and gave me the confidence to take the leap. I launched my company, eTech Solutions, with nothing but my laptop, a small loan from a business grant, and a whole lot of determination. The early days were tough. I worked around the clock, balancing client meetings, coding projects, and managing the day-to-day operations of the business. I made mistakes, missed deadlines, and dealt with difficult clients, but I refused to give up. I poured my heart and soul into eTech Solutions, and slowly but surely, it began to grow. I hired a small team of developers, rented a modest office space, and expanded my services. We took on bigger projects, working with companies across the country and even internationally. We built websites, developed custom software, and helped businesses streamline their operations. My company was thriving, and I was finally living the dream I'd fought so hard for. Within a few years, eTech Solutions was generating more revenue than I'd ever imagined. I was earning thousands each month, making a name for myself in the industry, and building a life that I was proud of. I'd gone from being a scared, homeless teenager to a successful entrepreneur, and it felt incredible. But even as my business thrived, there was still a part of me that carried the scars of my past. I'd worked so hard to prove my parents wrong, to show them that I was more than the failure they'd made me feel like. I'd achieved everything I'd ever wanted, but there was still a lingering sadness that I couldn't quite shake. I wanted them to see how far I'd come, but I didn't need their approval anymore. I was doing this for me. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a meeting with a client, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I usually ignored calls from numbers I didn't recognize, but something told me to pick up. I answered, and to my surprise, it was my mom's voice on the other end. "Emma," she said, sounding hesitant. "It's Mom." I hadn't spoken to my parents in years. After they kicked me out, we'd had minimal contact, mostly awkward holiday texts that felt more obligatory than heartfelt. I tried to make peace with the fact that they were never going to be the supportive parents I'd wanted, and I'd moved on, building my life without them. But hearing my mom's voice after all this time brought back a flood of emotions. "Hi, Mom," I replied cautiously. "What's going on?" She hesitated, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "I know it's been a long time, but your dad and we've been going through some tough times. Financially, things aren't great, and we're struggling to make ends meet." I listened in silence, not sure where this was going. My mom went on to explain that my dad's business had taken a hit, and they were drowning in debt. They'd been forced to downsize, sell their car, and were barely scraping by. It was a stark contrast to the life of comfort and stability they'd always projected. "I don't know how else to say this," my mom continued, her voice breaking. "We need help, Emma. We need your help." I was stunned. The parents who had kicked me out of the house without a second thought were now asking me for financial support. The irony was almost too much to bear. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. After everything they'd put me through, they were the ones coming to me for help. "Why are you asking me?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You made it clear years ago that I wasn't your responsibility." There was a long pause before my mom spoke again, her voice filled with a mix of desperation and shame. "We were wrong, Emma. We were too hard on you, and we didn't appreciate how much you were going through. I know we don't deserve it, but we're asking for your forgiveness and for your help." I didn't know how to respond. The hurt and anger that I'd buried for so long came rushing back, and I felt like that scared, abandoned teenager all over again. I thought about all the nights I'd spent crying myself to sleep, the endless shifts at the diner, and the struggle to get back on my feet without any support from them. But I also thought about how far I'd come. I wasn't that scared kid anymore. I was strong, successful, and in control of my own life. I didn't need their validation, and I certainly didn't owe them anything. But still, a part of me couldn't help but feel conflicted. They were my parents, after all, and as much as they'd hurt me, I didn't want to be the kind of person who turned her back on family in their time of need. I agreed to meet with my parents, partly out of curiosity and partly because I needed closure. I hadn't seen them in years, and I wanted to look them in the eye and hear what they had to say. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, and I walked in feeling a mix of nerves and defiance. I wasn't that scared girl anymore. I was a successful businesswoman who had built her life without their help. When I saw my parents, I barely recognized them. They looked older, more tired, and worn down by the years of hardship. My dad, who had always been so confident and self-assured, looked defeated, and my mom's once meticulously styled hair was now streaked with gray. It was jarring to see them like this, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for the people they used to be. "Emma," my dad said, standing up awkwardly as I approached. "Thank you for coming." I sat down, and for a moment, none of us spoke. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the weight of everything that had gone unsaid over the years. Finally, my mom broke the silence. "We've been struggling," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We made a lot of mistakes, and we've lost almost everything. We don't know what to do." I listened as they explained their situation in more detail, the failed business ventures, the mounting debts, and the constant fear of losing their home. They'd reached out to Caroline, but she was busy with her own life, and they didn't want to burden her. I could see the shame in their eyes, and it was clear that asking me for help was a last resort. "I'm sorry for what we did to you," my dad said, his voice choked with emotion. "We were wrong, and we see that now. You deserved better from us." Hearing those words was bittersweet. I'd spent years longing for an apology, for some acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, but now that it was here, it felt hollow. I wanted to forgive them, to let go of the anger and hurt that I'd carried for so long, but it wasn't that simple. Forgiveness isn't something you can force, it's a process, and I was still working through it. "I've worked hard to get where I am," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I did it without your help, and I don't owe you anything." My parents nodded, their expressions somber. "We know," my mom said quietly. "And we're not asking you to fix everything. We just need a little help to get back on our feet." I sat there, weighing my options. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who had been so desperate for their approval, and how far I'd come since then. I didn't need their validation anymore, but I also didn't want to be consumed by bitterness. Helping them wouldn't change the past, but maybe it could help me finally move on. After a long pause, I made my decision. "I'll help you," I said, my voice steady. "But this doesn't mean I've forgotten what you did. I'm doing this because I want to, not because I feel like I owe you anything." My parents nodded, tears welling up in their eyes. "Thank you, Emma," my dad said, his voice breaking. "We don't deserve your kindness, but we're grateful." Helping my parents wasn't an easy decision, but it was one I made for myself. I gave them enough to get back on their feet, but I made it clear that this was a one-time offer. I wasn't going to be their safety net, and I wasn't going to let them back into my life on their terms. I'd built something incredible on my own, and I wasn't about to let them take that from me. The experience forced me to confront my past in a way I hadn't before. I realized that I didn't need my parents' approval or apology to validate my success. I'd proven to myself that I was capable, resilient, and worthy of all the good things I'd built. Helping them was my way of taking control, of showing that I was no longer defined by their expectations or their rejection. I continued to grow my business, expanding my client base and taking on new challenges that pushed me to be even better. I hired more staff, launched new projects, and became a mentor to young women who were just starting out in the tech industry. It was important to me to give back, to use my success to lift others up and show them that they could overcome their own obstacles. I also started prioritizing my own happiness, something I'd neglected for so long. I traveled, took up new hobbies, and surrounded myself with people who supported and uplifted me. I learned to set boundaries, to protect my peace, and to let go of the need to please everyone. I was finally living life on my own terms, and it felt incredible. As for my parents, our relationship is still complicated. We talk occasionally, but it's clear that things will never be the same. They're grateful for my help, but I've made it clear that I'm not the scared, desperate girl they kicked out all those years ago. I'm strong, independent, and in control of my own destiny. And while I'll always care about them, I know that I'm not responsible for their happiness or their mistakes. To anyone out there who's been let down by the people they trusted most, just know that you are capable of so much more than you realize. You don't need anyone's approval to succeed, and you don't have to let your past define you. You are strong, resilient, and worthy of all the good things life has to offer. Keep pushing forward, and never let anyone tell you that you're not enough. Reddit update, the aftermath. Opie, I was kicked out of my home for failing a test, now I'm earning thousands, and my parents are begging me for money. Hey everyone, I just wanted to give an update and thank you for all the support and encouragement you've given me. It's been a long and challenging journey, but I've come out stronger on the other side. I've built a life that I'm proud of, and I've learned to value myself in a way that I never did before. My parents and I are still working through our issues, and while things are far from perfect, I'm learning to let go of the anger and focus on the future. I've realized that my success is my own, and no one can take that away from me. I'm excited about what's next, and I'm grateful for every challenge that's led me to where I am today. Thank you again to everyone who shared their own stories and offered advice. You've helped me more than you know. Remember, no matter what you've been through, you are not defined by your past. Keep moving forward, and never stop believing in yourself.